Welcome to my talk. It's about the case of the WordPress REST API. We're going to be talking about super high level. I don't want to get into too much detail as far as how to use it and too much of the development side of it. I've noticed a lot of people who are in all sorts of realms hear about the REST API and are just completely confused about what it is and what you can do with it. So that's where I'm going to start. This talk is pretty quick. I've given it once or twice before, but I love leaving ample time for questions. So if you have any questions about the API, what you can do with it, any questions at all, even if they're super advanced, feel free to put them in below and we'll get to them at the end. So a little bit about me. My name is Sivan. I've been using WordPress since pretty much the beginning. I think my first install was something like beta 0.7. Someone showed me this project that was kind of up and coming, and so I installed it, started running with it, and been using it ever since. I currently work at the Walt Disney Company. More specifically, I work for Disney Interactive. I do a lot of WordPress work. That's probably like 95% of my day job is doing stuff on WordPress, and I absolutely love it. I'm a member of the WP crowd. We are a WordPress community for both podcasts and articles. So check us out at WPCrowd.com. You can find me online, roysivan.com, and pretty much anywhere at royboy789. Okay, so the main question I wanted to answer with this talk was, why do we even need the WordPress REST API? I mean, is it something that we could live without? Is it something that we really need in our day-to-day lives? No, we don't at all. There's really no point for it. This is usually where if I'm in a room, I would walk out and say the end, because really there's no need for it. But it is really cool. So let's start at the beginning. What is an API? An API, as defined, is an application program interface. That's what it stands for. It's a set of routines, protocols, and tools for building software applications. So I know most of you are thinking, oh my God, you lost me at definition. So let's make it a little more simpler. An API lets you access or create data. In WordPress terms, the WordPress REST API allows you to access or create WordPress posts, pages, any other any other data that you create with the WordPress interface. So why do we need that? We still really don't need it, but maybe on some level you want access to a piece of content, or more importantly, you want someone else to access that piece of content, whether, again, it's a post or a page or anything like that. Whatever you're creating, it's not just about you having access to it. The API allows other people to have access to it. And one of the biggest selling points that I've seen across businesses is that the API isn't limited to communicating to other websites, right? So not just do websites communicate with the API, but now you have access through phone applications. So if you wanted to create a phone app that runs on native iOS or Android, which takes in all the data from or content from a department or from a specific professor, then you could do that with the phone app that communicates with the API. So the professor, or whatever it is, the department, the editors, would still work on WordPress, and they would still create content with WordPress. But then all of a sudden, you're allowing people to consume that data or that content in other fashions, whether it's another website or a phone application. So that's probably one of the biggest selling points to a lot of businesses, is the phone app. I'd highly recommend, if you are interested in going down that route, start with something called AppPresser. AppPresser is a plugin / kind of service that allows you to easily take your content and create phone applications which run natively on phones. So how do you API? Leveraging the API isn't exactly difficult, but there is kind of a new markup that you might have to get the hang of, and it's called JSON. It's a JavaScript object notation. And with JSON, you could actually use JavaScript, which is kind of the big deal nowadays, or actually PHP. The cool thing about JSON and PHP is that if you wanted to take your response from the API and use PHP to actually show it, JSON, there are native PHP functions that can actually decode JSON. It turns it into a regular array, like you would any other PHP array. It's pretty nifty. I find myself using it a lot, and that's how a lot of the unit testing is done for the API. But there are use cases where, while I'm doing a lot of JavaScript work with the API, or let's say building out a phone app, there are times where PHP does come in handy, because sometimes you want that first page load to communicate with the API server side, load up the first initial page, and then the rest of the page, pagination or anything else might happen with a JavaScript application instead. Just to give you a sample of what JSON looks like, this is a sample from the WP crowd, actually. It's a snippet of kind of formatted JSON. And as you can see, if you're familiar with objects in JavaScript, it's just an object. And when you're pinging the API through the routes, you actually get an array of all of these objects. Again, I don't want to go too deep into any of this. I'm now on the WPCampus Slack. Again, you can find me online. So if you want to get more into detail about like the routes and customization and the code behind it, let me know. I'm trying to keep this talk high level. So the big question I get a lot is, do I really need to learn JavaScript deeply? So 2 years ago or so, Matt Mullenweg said during his State of the Word that you should be learning JavaScript and JavaScript deeply. And a lot of that tied into the API, because the API does a lot of the, people are digesting the API with JavaScript. So JavaScript frameworks, applications, things like that. And that's great, except you don't really need to learn JavaScript in order to use the API. So there was actually just an episode about this on the WP crowd, which I found pretty interesting, because I was talking to a friend of mine, Josh Pollock, about it. And it's true, in a lot of use cases where I've actually built out very custom Angular front ends, right? So I'm a big Angular fan. So I've built a very intense Angular front end that interacts with data and other APIs. 90% of my work, maybe not 90%, but a good chunk of my work was actually done in PHP instead. The API is built in PHP, so is the rest of WordPress for that matter. So if you are just getting into the API and you want to see what it can do and you want to start customizing it, you don't really need to learn JavaScript quite yet, or at least not deeply. You can actually get by with some basic jQuery knowledge and still spit out, let's say, data. But when you talk about custom business logic that runs behind the scenes, in my example, it was a lot of like Stripe payment gateway stuff and other like user creation. All of this happens in PHP. So don't worry if you haven't learned JavaScript quite yet. It's not 100% necessary to use the API, so don't worry about that. But in the long run, if you want to go down that path of creating, Angular, React front ends, then yeah, you're gonna have to learn JavaScript. All right, so what can you build with the API? And that's been a question that I get a lot, because people, again, don't really understand what you do with it. Our biggest thing that you will see built with the API are applications. So applications, or web applications for that matter, are usually high intense, high functionality websites. So not your typical, business SMB website, but something you can log into, interact with. I take for an example, something I'm working on right now for a client, which is a custom like greeting card creator. And so most of their data is actually done in WooCommerce, right? They created the products. All the data lives within the WooCommerce product through post meta. But I created an Angular front end. So when you actually want to edit that product to customize it for your needs, it's actually all done through an Angular application, which takes that data and then runs with it in a customized editor. It uses all sorts of cool 3D effects, but for the most part, it's a really intense UI that you can't just, I guess you could create it in PHP or have it sit on the page, but they wanted to actually have it separated out because separation of concerns on just their app. And again, it communicates with the WordPress website and through WooCommerce. As you're kind of building out this customized front end or your customized product, you end at a checkout, right? So when you save your card and you go through a checkout, the checkout button actually interacts with the API by adding the product to your cart with the variation. So there are actually variations involved. And then it redirects you to the checkout page. So it was actually pretty intense, but it was a lot of fun. So that's an example of something you can build with it. And that was kind of an application that lived kind of within another WordPress. So WordPress kind of surrounded this application. And most of the time it usually would be in WordPress, but then for the editing of the product to make customized, they would actually go into an application. Full single page web applications powered by JavaScript are another big thing that you're going to see nowadays. I have an example of this with AngularJS. If you look at my GitHub, basically it's a full client-side powered theme that's built in AngularJS, and it interacts with the WordPress site. So as you're creating data or content on the back end, it's showing up on the front end, and it's all single page. It's all 100% JavaScript powered. And again, it might not be the best use case, but it's just a good way to show the world what you can do with it. With JavaScript single page applications, SEO isn't your best friend. So that's why I say for a blog site, definitely not something you want to use a JavaScript framework for. But if you're building something really intense or something really high functioning, then yeah, it might be the way to go. Again, the API allows you to connect with your data. So another thing that I've seen a lot of people build with it is modular little pieces of content. If you look at my website, roysivan.com, right underneath the main hero, I have a filterable pieces of content, right? So I have my GitHub projects, my speaking engagements, and my portfolio. Everything is on like the left, and then I have like a grid on the right. And while this may not seem that crazy, because you'll see a lot of sliders or anything like that do very similar functionality, every time you click on a label, it interacts with the API and spits out a new grid onto the page with this new data, right? So if you go from GitHub to, let's say, my work, it'll actually take away all the GitHub projects that I have, which is a custom post type, and then load in my portfolio work, which again is another custom post type. So, and that was done really simply. That was a simple little chunk of code that I built pretty quickly. And another really great example would be I have in the WordPress plugin repo, there's a plugin called AngularJS for WordPress. Again, I'm a huge Angular fan, been that way for a very long time. Definitely don't need to have a debate over what framework or anything, but my plugin actually uses shortcode. So you actually put in a shortcode, for example, ng posts, which would then list out kind of like a blog roll, your last, let's say, 5-10 posts, but that's all run through an Angular application. Again, people will ask me why a lot, and there's not really a good use case for it all the time. It is kind of just a fun thing that I worked on. The main benefit of loading things client side is just taking the load off the server. And this was something I preached about a lot a couple years back, where I said, hey, you should be building client side because you want to take the stress off your server, but technology has caught up with me. Servers are now really fantastic. And even some of the shared hosts are pretty capable of handling quite a load. So pushing everything in the client side is great, only from a UI point of view, and that's where I kind of leave it. if you want to do some intricate UI work, animations, things like that, that's really where JavaScript's going to be your best friend. And again, grabbing that data from the API is going to be helpful. I'm curious what you guys have seen built with it. You could either leave it in the chat or or just tell me later. But if you guys seen anything built with it, let me know. All right, so I do have some example use cases that I wanted to share with you. So my case for this one is a website which is used to create events. And my examples here are things you could do with the API, because the question is, what can you do with the API? My first thing that I would probably want to build is the phone app with the calendar of events. So if you have a department that has events, or a website that has your events, you could create a phone app which will run natively on anyone's phone, which would easily allow them access to those events. A widget, so just like every other event calendar plugin kind of has a widget for a sidebar, you could create a custom widget which actually pulls on the data from another website. So if you have one website which manages all of your events across the campus, you could have a widget which would allow anyone really on any website built on WordPress, or really any widget, if it's not WordPress or not, to showcase a list or a calendar of those events. My favorite one is the custom dashboard. I love building custom dashboards for people where sometimes WordPress is a little bit too much. And I know WordPress is super simple and everyone's like, it's kind of the de facto thing. But sometimes people who are editors or people who don't need all of the backend that is WordPress, they just want a simple way to create or manage events, right? So building out a custom dashboard, and this is where a JavaScript framework might come in handy, you could interact with the API and have it live somewhere else. Again, whether it's a phone app or on another website altogether, you could have a custom dashboard, and then ultimately no one even needs to see the website which powers all the data, right? So the data could be sitting there and no one needs to see that website. And if someone stumbles on it, fine, but that could be a site that just stores data, and then administrators would have access to the back end. But a custom dashboard will allow people to come in and, based on credentials, obviously create or edit events, and without ever needing to go to the WP admin. I had a cool use case for if multi-site. So if you have multiple websites, let's say each are a department, you could combine, let's just say multiple websites which all create events, right? So multiple websites which have the power to create events, and each of them, let's say, is a department in your school. You could combine all of that data and to create one calendar. So if you have 10 departments in your school and each one of them has functionality to create events on their main website, you could then take all of that data and on the main school website or some main website, combine all that data into one place and easily create a calendar, which so people can see. And then when they click on the event, they would then go to that department's page where they can get event details, things like that. But ultimately, it's one location for all of that content to live. And that allows for really a lot of the it allows you to not have to duplicate content across multiple sites. So if you create content once and it can get sent out to and or digested by other applications. And another thing I thought about was a customized UI or for the application. I do have an actual use case for this. Working at Disney, we get great perks, one of which is we're allowed to get into a lot of the parks, but we do have lockout dates. So lockout dates are actually categorized by what type of what's being blocked, right? So whether it's a certain type of ticket that we can get or whether it's our main pass, things like that. So bringing this back to events, you could have multiple of all of your events, right, across all departments come into one calendar. And then you could say, okay, let's click just one department, right? And that would only show that department. Or another cool thing to do would be categorization, right? So if all of your departments had a calendar, right, system, and each one of those had the same categories, you can now categorize across your whole campus events on one calendar. I thought that was a pretty cool approach, and it's pretty cool to see what people are doing with the API in that kind of use case. This is another similar example. So multiple sites under one main site. And I was listening to the last talk, and this kind of reminded me of this. So basically, let's say you have a department website, and underneath the department, each professor has their own website. You could showcase the professor's content on the main department website directly without having to duplicate any content, and then link directly to that professor's page, right? So if the professor created a new blog post, whatever it is, that could show up on the department's website in a section. And then when you click on it, it would then take you to their website, and you would see the article there. Again, if you have a whole bunch of professors under one department, when you go into a professor's site, you could use, again, a widget to showcase content from other professors. Specifically, again, if you're using shared categories. So if a professor is writing something about, and again, because it's a department, it's usually the same, more or less, field or study, they could share content based on categorization of content. And so you could showcase what one professor is doing on another professor's site based on the category. So very similar to like featured or just a categorization of content. It allows you to easily share and get people to go from one professor to the other. I thought this was a cool idea. I'd love to see something like that actually done. And I've played around with it. Another very similar use case, I don't have another slide for it, was multilingual. So I know a lot of universities and a lot of companies in general need to use WPML for having multiple languages available for their content. So think of it like that, right? If you have one main website, we'll say English, and then instead of using WPML, which, love or hate it, can be kind of detrimental, can be a pretty big plugin to have. Let's say you wanted to allow multiple other sites, which are multi-sites underneath for each language, right? Or each country, region, whatever. This allows for people to log in directly to each site without having a connection to the main site. You could create a way for someone who is in the English site to post a piece of content and then share it to all of the region sites, or vice versa. Someone logs into a region site, sees, whatever, Spanish, right? So they're logging into the Spanish version of the website. They see that a new English post has been created, and they want to translate it. So they could bring in that data to a new post on the Spanish site, already formatted with H2s, H1s, all of that stuff in English. And then all they would have to do is then spend the time to translate it. And then they have a fully formatted, easy to upload and publish Spanish version of that same exact article. So I'm sorry, catching up with the chat a little bit, but yeah, so that's another use case I was talking to somebody about with the multi-language, because I'm not a huge WPML fan, and not that I use it very often. So, but I like the idea of kind of one centralized location where it gets sent out, and then you can translate from there. So as I said, my talk is going to be pretty short, and that's about it. As I said, it's going to be super high level. Again, you could find me online, roysivan.com. You can find me on the WP crowd. And also, if you want to get into JavaScript applications and JavaScript and Angular, check out lynda.com and look for Roy Sivan. I'm on there. I've done a course. It's a little bit old now, but it actually runs through Angular 1.x and the REST API and how to build a client-side application. It's really basic. It's just a blog list and a blog detail, but it might get you your feet wet in how to use an advanced JavaScript framework with the REST API, and then you can kind of go from there. So I'm gonna check out if I have any questions. Let's see. How to use WordPress after capturing post images on WordPress sites at our universities and displaying them on us. Backend. Okay, looking at Leah Ruth's question. I'm a little confused. It looks like you want to create a slider which is powered by, on a Drupal site, which is powered by WordPress data. Is that correct? You could just answer in the chat. Well, I'll just go along with that. So if that's what you're asking, yes, you could definitely create a slider or any type of UI on any website which consumes the API. And if you're on Drupal, that doesn't really matter. It's the same thing. The Drupal slider would be running in JavaScript, would first make a call to your WordPress site, right? And it would either call on, and then the WordPress, the API has a whole bunch of routes which allows you to filter content. So if you only have certain pieces of content that you want to show, you can actually go through that. But there are, so once you get that data and you saw the JSON, right? So the JSON is there. You can either use a featured image, which I think comes out by default in the data, or you might have to do a customization. So the one thing I love about the API is they built it to be highly customizable. You could both create new routes, which are new URLs, which then get data, spit out JSON, or you can actually customize the data that gets spit out. So if you wanted to customize what /post, which is your default, post type JSON feed, you could customize the data that comes out. So if, let's say, you're using a custom meta field or a post meta field via like ECF or something for your image for the slider, what you would do is then just say, hey, I need to make a little modification, make sure this spits out with the JSON, and then you can consume it. And on the Drupal side, you would then see that data, and then you could then create your slider based on that. It's a really good use case. I've seen it done quite a few times, and we actually have done it a few times as well, where one site consumes just image data or something like that from another site. Have you worked with both WP and Drupal APIs? How does WP apply to Drupal? I haven't messed with Drupal 8 yet. I'm not really a big Drupal fan. I haven't been since about 6. I mean, I've done little projects here and there with it. I have talked a lot to Josh K of Pantheon Hosting, who's a big proponent of Drupal, headless Drupal. And by headless Drupal, I mean using just the API, not necessarily the templating. And he said it's pretty good, the API on the Drupal side. And so, I haven't personally played around with it, but I've heard it's pretty good. If you wanted to work with both, right, and you were creating a custom JavaScript application, this is where APIs really are the kind of like the bread and butter. And what I love about APIs is you could create a custom dashboard, whatever it is you're creating, and consume data from multiple locations. So if, for example, if you wanted to see both data from a WordPress site and a Drupal site in one place, you could create a custom dashboard living in a third place, which then consumes both of those and displays it. Great for content editors or people who are managing content, as well as if you wanted to create something for users to then see data from multiple places, which are powered by different things, right? So if like one department refuses to leave Drupal, but every other department uses WordPress, you could still create one interface which shows all of the data together as one website using APIs. Okay, going down. Since you work for Disney, did you know that Little Star Wars was released today? I did not. Good to know. It's also really early my time. I've been up. I was up like 10 minutes before the first presentation, so I will definitely check it out as soon as I end here. Our API endpoints URL structure likely to change? Is the plugin no longer necessary now that? So I know, Josh, I know your question has been answered kind of, but just to bring it up for everybody, and especially for the recording, API URLs, the endpoint / the URL structure probably won't change anytime soon. And the plugin isn't really necessary because in 4.7, the plugin was merged into core. Before now, we had kind of half of the API, and you could kind of build out on top of that. But now that it's in core, you get access to all the endpoints that were in the plugin, as well as all the functionality of creating new endpoints and customizing the output data, all within core. It's really been a lot of fun kind of transitioning a lot of my sites away from the typical norm of, transitioning my sites away from having the plugin. I don't know where my brain is at. I'm getting a little sick today. But yeah, getting rid of the plugin altogether and saying, hey, WordPress can now do this. Another thing I wanted to touch on is there was kind of a talk about security, I think, a couple days ago. And I haven't dug too much into it. I think it was like a word fence kind of thing where I feel like maybe they were kind of pushing something, but completely just my opinion. I haven't looked into it yet. For us on our end, it's about for security, whatever security you're using now, whatever precautions are going to help. I can recommend if you want to really lock down your API but still use it. Something that we've done in the past is actually when you create data with an API, it's an HTTP post request, right? So a post request that gets sent out to your API. That's how you actually create data. What we did was put it on lockdown. We said anytime a post request came in from that URL structure, which is basically they're all going to be the same, starting out with WP-JSON after your domain name. Any post request, basically we said no, we rejected. So that was like super critical way of doing security. There's obviously a lot of security built into the API. There are ways to do OAuth, cookie-based, as well as basic authentication, all built right in. OAuth, I think, requires a separate plugin, which I've played around a little bit with, but I've been a big fan of using nonces and stuff like that. I also build a lot of internal tools mainly instead of external tools, so that's kind of what I do. Let's see if there's any more questions. How light is the REST call when building out smart content modules at one point with in a transient? Good question. So transients are something I've looked into using instead of making the call to the REST API, calling on the transient object instead. I haven't seen too much performance increase with it. I've done it a few times just for testing reasons, like calling the transient if data has not been updated. And I want to say it's almost built in now, but again, I use a lot of caching. So a lot of that kind of, even like just the response is cached at this point. So I don't really, I haven't had to deal with that too much anymore. What we do is we just cache the response from the URL directly. And then we'll update that every once in a while, but not necessarily on the WordPress, not on the application layer. It's on the server layer. It looks like there's no more questions. Was there anything else that anyone wanted to go over with the API? I do have quite a bit of time left, but I knew I was going to run short. Cool. If you guys have any more questions, again, feel free to catch me on Twitter or anywhere else, RoyBoy789, or online. I'm also now on the WPCampus Slack, so feel free to ping me there directly. And thank you guys for joining, and thank you for being part of WPCampus Online. It's been a lot of fun.